Olá a todos, boa tarde, espero que estejam todos bem. A gente está aqui em mais um capítulo dos eventos preparatórios da Associação Brasileira de Relações Internacionais para a nossa conferência de pós-graduação, que vai acontecer em breve. Eu sou Guilherme Casarões, coordenador da área temática de análise de política externa da Associação Brasileira de RI, e hoje eu estou moderando aqui um grande debate, uma grande discussão sobre populismo e análise de política externa, que conta com 3 participantes: o professor Leslie Werner, da Universidade de Bath, a professora Débora Barros Leal, da UNSW, South Wales, em Sydney, e o professor Davi Magalhães, professor da PUC de São Paulo e da FAAP, aqui no Brasil. Eu vou fazer essa transmissão em inglês, o debate vai acontecer na língua inglesa, eu estou fazendo essa apresentação em português para dar-lhes as boas-vindas, para a gente poder falar um pouquinho também do ciclo de eventos que a ABRE vem proporcionando à comunidade acadêmica de relações internacionais, mas a partir de agora eu vou mudar para o inglês para a gente poder fazer a nossa conversa do dia de hoje. So, today's topic of discussion is populism and foreign policy analysis. I have three guests here, Professor Leslie Werner, Professor Débora Barros Leal, and Professor Davi Magalhães. They will be talking about their own research agendas on populism and foreign policy. Dr. Werner talks a little bit about role theory as well, so I imagine he's going to address both topics together. Professor Débora Barros Leal she's Brazilian, so she lives in Sydney, but she's done extensive research work on Brazil and Brazilian foreign policy. So she's going to talk about foreign policy and populism in the Brazilian case, in Bolsonaro's case. And Professor Magalhães, he is an experienced lecturer and professor on issues such as the rise of the far right around the world and populism. So he's going to be the discussant of today's session, but he's also going to make some appointments on his own research agenda that touches upon the relationship between populism and foreign policy. So thank you very much for being here with us. I really appreciate your presence. We have 3 fantastic professors talking on this topic, which is one of the most important discussions of today's world, especially on the eve of the US presidential election. So I think there will be lots to talk about, not only about our own specific research agendas, Latin America, Brazil, or the rise of the far right globally, but also we can say a few words, we can think about the implications of populism to the United States foreign policy, especially thinking about this Trump era, which at least I hope will end very soon. But anyways, we're going to start. I'm going to pass on the word to Professor Leslie Werner. I thank you very much for your availability. I know I think it's a bit late.
Not that too
in
late.
England now. 10 p.m.
Yeah, 9.
Okay.
It's 3 hours difference, I think, with you.
Okay. Yeah, 9 p.m. now. So thank you so much. And as previously accorded, we have 20 to 25 minutes to each one of the presenters. So I'll pass on the word to you. Leslie, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. I think this is a great opportunity for me to exchange ideas with all of you. And apologies for making you switch the language. I know that if it were for me, then we would be speaking Portuguese. But thank you very much for that as well. I just want to start just to mention some key aspects of populism and foreign policy. First of all, I think it's no big surprise that the topic of populism and foreign policy is actually a hot topic nowadays, especially in Brazil, right? In fact, the interplay of populism and foreign policy has only started to receive scholarly and academic attention. Maybe the main reason, and actually something that you mentioned already, is the rise of Donald Trump to power in the US. I don't know whether we should thank him or not, but I mean, one of the key reasons of why we're studying this is because of Donald Trump and what it means for the foreign policy of the US as the great power. So, but in this presentation, I will try to make some few points based on the article Cameron Thies and I published in the journal International Relations. These publications came out a few months ago, which is open access for everyone. So apologies for the shameless self-promotion, but I think you might, if you are interested in these topics, I recommend you to read these articles. So my few points I want to make today are to clarify what it is and what is not a populist foreign policy. Clarify where we should focus when studying and observing populist foreign policy by referring to the conceptual properties of the concept of populism. And actually, the third point, how we can observe populist foreign policy, which is, in this case, we do it through the use of roles and narrations of roles in Argentina's foreign policy under Carlos Menem in the 90s, and the case of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. So, of course, I do not claim my way is the only way, but I think by using elements of comparative politics and foreign policy, such as roles, which are the manifestations of behavior of a state, we can make sense and possibly capture the populist dimension in a foreign policy. Populism, as I mentioned before, has recently gained appeal in describing the foreign policy principles, rhetoric, strategies of actors such as the United States under Trump, the United Kingdom in the light of Brexit, and in Europe as different populist movements counter the liberal values of the European Union. So basically, populism seems to be everywhere at the moment. And I think you are experiencing that in Brazil too. So, however, populism is nothing new in Latin America. We have at least 4 waves of populist experiences in Latin America. We have President Perón and Vargas in the 30s and 50s. We have Menem, Abdallah Bucaram, Fujimori in Peru in the 90s. We have another wave with Morales, Correa, Chavez in the 2000s. And nowadays we are experiencing Bolsonaro and the government of Manuel López Obrador in Mexico. And these people have become icons of populism in Latin America. But despite this, we have little knowledge of their resulting foreign policies. Therefore, in this article with Cameron Thies, we want to analyze the type of foreign policy populist governments advance by addressing 2 simple questions that guide our research. And these 2 questions are, what roles do populist governments conceive and play internationally? How do populists use these roles for their own political projects? Our contribution is that we seek to improve the literature on populist foreign policy by developing theory and testing some expectations or some assumptions by comparing these 2 cases of Chavez and Argentina. So we developed a middle-range theory based on some simple dichotomies about Latin American foreign policy and the use of role theory concepts to observe them in the cases of Menem and Argentina and Chavez in Venezuela. Our argument, or what I argue, is that populist foreign policies comes in different forms as the type, as the type of roles of populist leaders play internationally depends on the thick or thin ideologies that they pair with populism. Hence, a comparison of 2 cases of populism actually can shed light on the type of international behavior populist leaders seeks to advance and discredit actually the notion that there is only one type of populist foreign policy, as has been assumed by some literature on foreign policy. In a way, we discredit that there is one type of populist foreign policy which is always anti-plural, anti-democratic, and anti-liberal order, as assumed by most of the literature on populism in foreign policy. The reason is that this type of literature focuses on right-wing movements in Europe and or the case of the US, and not much attention has been paid to the diversity of populism in the global south. Another contribution of our article, or our research, is to show that actually populism is not just a right-wing phenomenon, as it can also be present in left-wing political projects, as it was the case of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. I want to clarify, however, that we are not voting here or saying that there are good and bad populisms in foreign policy. Is not our purpose at all. But actually, not all of them seek to undermine the pillars of the international liberal order and the value of international institutions as assumed in the literature. And when we talk about the value of international institutions, we are talking more about the architecture of global governance. So by now, you might be wondering, what is populism? Actually, populism is a very slippery concept that has been stretched a lot, more of what is recommendable, and actually in some cases has been used rather pejoratively too. So populism can be a style, a strategy, possibly a pathology, or some sort of discursive practice. However, in our work, we use the ideational definition of populism because it fits quite well with symbolic interactionist world theory, which also has an ideational dimension. Therefore, we just actually borrow the concept of populism from Casmuth, from comparative politics literature, which defines populism as a sin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two antagonist groups: the poor people versus the corrupt elite, which argues that politics should also be the expression of the general will of the people. As a sin-centered ideology, populism always requires a companion ideology to give it direction, action, and motivation in foreign policy. And companion ideologies could be another thin ideology like nationalism, as it is the case of Bolsonaro or Trump, or be paired with thick ideologies such as socialism or liberalism. So this conceptualization of populism allows us to use a very basic notion of populist foreign policy, which refers to all types of role-based actions that includes narratives of elite versus people and the general will. In this sense, a non-populist foreign policy lacks the core of what constitutes populism as a sin-centered ideology. When the leader does not refer to the people in antagonistic terms against the elite, and when he does not justify the actions in terms of the general will, then the foreign policy narratives in which roles are present and embedded are not populist in nature. Therefore, it depends on the thick and thin ideology that populism is paired with, which becomes the domestic sources for the roles that populist governments play or seek to enact internationally. Here we capture the domestic sources of roles of a populist government when acting internationally in a very simple dichotomy, or some very simple dichotomies: party positioning, whether you are left or right, as a dichotomy, not as a continuum, or whether it is socialist or neoliberal in nature when it comes to economic, and whether it favors or not economic globalization. So those are very simple dichotomies we use, yet this hardly captures the tradition of foreign policies of Latin American states. Once again, these are only domestic sources for the type of roles a state might play internationally, but they need to be considered, as after all, populism as a social phenomenon starts domestically, and there is the need to reflect these domestic sources of ideological, political, and economic influences that shape and inform the role choices of populist government on the international stage. But what is a role? And I think you might have been wondering about this by now. Roles are both positions in an organized group and any socially recognized category of factors. That is the type of factor is possible to be in a given society. So roles are always relational because any role needs a counter role. For example, it's not enough that I call myself a leader if I don't have a follower, at least one. So otherwise I cannot constitute a role relationship. But leaders from states like Trump, Bolsonaro, they tend to articulate role conceptions for their own countries all the time. like regional leader, faithful ally, rival, developer, active independent, and so on. And such roles take into account domestic and international politics. Leaders must take into account domestic contestation over the appropriate role for the country. And here's where actually our dichotomies are quite useful, because that contestation over the appropriate role for the country, it comes from political ideology, left, right, it comes from economic ideology, neoliberal socialist, and also an external dimension from, the attitudes towards protectionist or free trade orientation to globalization. So yet leaders and states need to negotiate and locate these roles at the international level. It's some sort of a two-level game, so domestic and international level. So for leaders and states to negotiate and locate these roles internationally, we capture the international dimensions of roles and role relationships through traditional key aspects of Latin American foreign policy. Latin American foreign policy is conditioned by two overlapping dimensions: pro-core versus anti-core, autonomy versus dependency. What do we mean by this? Pro versus anti-core foreign policy revolves around whether policymakers are agreeable or rather hostile to the dominant powers and the international order they enforce. And when we talk about the international orders they enforce, we talk basically about this architecture of global governance, and within that architecture of global governance, their attitudes and positions towards certain multilateral institutions. When it comes to autonomy and dependent foreign policy orientations, actually these refer to the ability to develop and implement foreign policy with or without international influence. The interplay of domestic and international can tell us the type of roles a populist leader advances and the set of narrations of a leader that a leader promotes, where roles are embedded and where we can possibly find references to this triad: people versus elite and for the general will. I will not go into the set of propositions we developed with Cameron, but these reflect these dichotomies mentioned before, and all these analytical, theoretical, and methodological steps that we take serve the purpose of narrowing down the analysis of Menem and Chavez, which I will refer now very briefly. In the case of Argentina under Carlos Saúl Menem, we see that before Menem comes to power, Argentina has traditionally played an active independent role in international politics, which means that the key driver of that independent role was the constant quest for autonomy. And we see that is also supplemented or complemented with other roles like non-aligned role, developing and third world state. However, when Menem comes to power, Menem's populist foreign policy led to role change to faithful ally, aligned state, regional integrationist, and multilateral state. So let's focus on the faithful ally role. Actually means that reflected his movement towards dependency and pro-core, as well as his adoption of the neoliberal economic model, right? So, and you might say, and so what? Because most of the Latin American countries were switching to a neoliberal economic model in the 90s. However, in the case of Argentina, we see that Menem enacted this faithful ally role of the US, and that covered the security dimension. So when it comes to security aligning with the US in Latin America, the rest of the Latin American countries were not as enthusiastic about that vis-a-vis Argentina, right? So maybe you remember that Argentina sent two warships to the Gulf in that conflict, right? So that actually is a reflection of this faithful ally role. So in that rhetoric, but in the narrative of Menem, and the Argentine foreign policy in this period, we see actually that the triad is not that strong. Pro-people, anti-elitism are present in the rhetoric of Menem in foreign policy, but actually it goes more towards the domestic level. And here is actually that by enacting the role of faithful ally, what Menem is doing is trying to present this transformation in the foreign policy as something that would benefit the people at the expense of of the bureaucracy, which is actually identified and created as the so-called elite in Argentina. So it's not the business elite or the economic elite, it's actually the bureaucracy that was hampering the neoliberal transformations in the country. So we see that actually this is the triad pro-people, anti-elite, and general will is not that strong in this case. However, when we go to the case of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, we see that before, and just to give you a bit of context here, Venezuela, before Chavez comes to power, we see that traditionally Venezuela has been playing a role of a friend and partner of the US in the region of Latin America. We see that with Chavez, Chavez actually strong anti-core autonomy and socialist agendas led to new roles such as the anti-imperialist agent, liberator role, bastion of revolution, and enemy and rival of the US. And here, once again, we see domestic sources as informing these roles, like the socialism of the 21st century, which actually rejected neoliberalism, and the Bolivarian Revolution presented alternatives to the US leaderships and institutions, and possibly vis-a-vis Brazil as well. We have to remember that Venezuela in this period also casted a regional group called ALBA and actually tried to provide certain leadership to allied countries in this case. So populist elements are quite strong domestically and internationally in the rhetoric or in the narrative of Hugo Chavez and Venezuela, as we expect. And here, where we see that constant reference to the oligarchia or oligarchs and the corrupt elites within Venezuela, but as well in Latin America. Because Venezuela and actually Chavez presented itself as the savior of the region and trying to diffuse the benefits of the so-called socialism of the 21st century in the region. And actually, the elites were seen and depicted by Chavez as an extension of the US influence. So, moreover, Chavez also, what we find in the narratives of Chavez and foreign policy narratives, we see that actually Chavez identifies closely with the poor people and often considers himself their savior or messiah. So, in conclusion, in our paper, we conclude that there is no single form taken by populist foreign policy, but one needs to pay attention to the core people versus elite and for the general will. And populism as a sin-centered ideology needs companion ideologies to give it direction and action. In Latin America, the domestic dichotomies and two axioms at the international level provided the elements for populists to formulate their foreign policies. Roles provide us a means to observe them, and role theory help us to understand how populism interacts with traditional domestic determinants of foreign policy. The combination of theory plus comparison of cases provides knowledge that we could not otherwise have obtained. Now, how do I connect when we talk about Brazil, and very briefly, when we talk about Bolsonaro and his foreign policy, and we think within our own theoretical framework that Cameron Thies and I developed, we see that Bolsonaro and his foreign policy will tend to play roles such as the anti-globalizer and other type of roles that tend to undermine the liberal international order, because the ideological companion of his populism is another thin ideology, which is nationalism. Yet, how that is being played internationally? First, with nationalism as a key driver of Brazil's foreign policy, the leader role reputation of Brazil has been severely undermined in South America. So playing a leader role is no longer expected by other states in the region. Second, Bolsonaro has tried to enact more of an active independent role internationally. Yet, the nationalistic discourse produced role dissonance and conflict for Brazil, which has pushing more towards an isolated role as not even the US reciprocates the attempts of Bolsonaro to advance a new role type of role relationship between the US and Brazil, sustained by their respective populist leaders. And this is not good for a state that a few years ago was actually a recognized regional power and above all, an emerging one on the international system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. It was amazing. And it's really, I mean, it's not only an argument that, sorry, it's not just an argument that serves well for this cross-ideological comparison between Argentina and Venezuela, but it's also very enlightening to think about Brazil's case. And it even invites for comparisons, for example, between Lula and Bolsonaro, which are which have been labeled populists, even though in very different fashions, right? So I think it was very interesting because it opens up a whole road of investigation of interpretations about Brazil as well. So thank you very much for that. Now I pass the word to Professor Débora Barros Leal. Thank you so much for being with us in I think a chilly Sydney morning, perhaps.
Well, it's not as bad today. The sun has decided to come out. It's going to be a nice 21 degrees with sun. And yes, I just finished my coffee. So everybody's running on coffee for you guys to stay awake. For me, it's to stay awake, but it's Friday. So all is good. I live in the future. Okay, so thank you very much for this invitation. This is a topic, again, that it's one of those nerd topics that you just get excited about. And I think as academics, we have at least this ability to make silver linings into really like bad situations. Oh, that's a really interesting, intriguing empirical case, for investigation. So it's not that anybody's happy that Brazil is, under a far-right populist government, but it does bring us different opportunities for publishing, I guess. I mean, we're savage in that way. So I would start by asking for Masu to put up my presentation. There's a couple of things that I'm going to talk about that they overlap well already, obviously, with a lot of stuff that Leslie have said. My problem is that I tend to digress. So that's why I like to have PowerPoints, because it can keep me sharp. So with this, it goes obviously with the first question about anyone looking at analyzing any sort of government empirically when it comes to labeling it a populist. And the first thing that comes with it is because, by the way, I'm giving this sign, I'm giving the thumbs up. You can just go back. I'm giving the thumbs up just because there's someone, so I don't have to keep saying forward. So populism, I think you can also send to the idea of an essentially contested concept. So that's why it will always be hard to work with populism, because you're talking about a concept as you would be with democracy, as you would be with using a concept like authoritarianism or justice. It is essentially a contested concept, which brings me to Justice Potter Stewart and this phrase that a lot of you have probably seen, right? So I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it. If you don't know the context, this was in the late 1960s, when there was late 1960s, early 70s, I think, when there was a case that came up to the US Supreme Court, and it was about pornography. And it was about the difference. How do you tell between pornography and art, anatomy? And basically one of the things he said in his argument, it's like, I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it. Of course, we can't be just discussing in especially in a theoretical context, this sort of thing. But that's why, and then if we go to the next slide, also what you have is Derendorf's idea that this is probably at the core of why it is so difficult when you're looking at empirical cases, because one's populism is another one's democracy and vice versa. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily, that both points of view are correct. But it does mean that, again, with any empirical case, that's probably the first thing that comes up. It's to say, no, that he's not a populist. He speaks for the people. And you can go in both directions. I mean, you can take Chavez, you can take Trump, you can take, and this really resonates. So once we go into really, again, a lot of these things have been covered by Leslie, but it's just at least for me to keep in context. So once you're talking about populism, you're essentially talking about these two main elements, anti-pluralism and elitism. So basically what I have there, it's more I wanted to transmit this idea of, there's this idea of boundaries, there's this idea of separation, and that it's not really about a democracy with pluralistic views. It's about really creating these, well, I mean, Trump's invites sort of invitation, you know, you're creating walls to really sort of say who's in and who's out, and who, you know, which groups are. So it's really about this sort of separation within a democracy. And then we come to anti-pluralism, and essentially here, what you have with anti-pluralism is basically this idea of us versus them. And of course, this is what makes, again, also the study of populism so intriguing, is because the us versus them is, imagine like an empty vessel. It's an empty signifier. So anything can fit there. You can, it's a matter. It is also so challenging, but also so fascinating to be studying populism, both from the sense of comparing different countries, but even within a country, because you'll see the different groups that go into us versus them, which leads us then to the issue of anti-elitism, which is basically, again, these are sort of core things that are taken, accepted in, if you're studying populism, this idea that you have the pure people versus the corrupt elite. And I mean, I will go back to this, and anyone from Brazil in the past 2 years have experienced this. Whether you are pro-Bolsonaro or anti-Bolsonaro, you are forced or voluntarily volunteer, you know, as tribute, to be placed into one of these categories, to say, this is my group. And it really, it's this idea that gives no space to, and I mean, anyone, again, all Brazilians can experience this, even Brazilians living abroad, is that nowadays, I mean, I don't know how it is in Brazil, you know, now, I can't say I've been outside for 12 years, but at least here, like being in Sydney, there's a lot of Brazilians. But one of the first things when you meet, you'll see people like, is he pro-Bolsonaro or not? Even to see if you're going to someone's house, if you're going to a barbecue, because you're like, you know, and depending where you sit, you're like, well, that's going to be a little bit awkward. And I just don't want to, you know, I don't want to engage. So yeah, conversations. No, it doesn't. Anyway, so the next one, and then we have basically, this is the main problem with populism when you're looking at it, I think, especially from a policy perspective, and especially from a democratic perspective, because the idea is that compromise is bad. So this issue that we have in a democracy, again, pluralism, that is, you recognize that there's a lot of different opinions. That is a healthy democracy. You do have people that think differently. It's part of the process. But in populism, what you really have is this sense that you can't compromise, because, which takes us to the next one, which is really this idea that there's only two things in a democracy. There's only right or wrong. There isn't this sort of, well, this, it's a very raw argument. It's a very, there's not really a lot of thought, let's say, that goes into this. It's supposed to be this sort of very manichaeist interpretation. So what I will do now is just, I'll share here my screen, because there's just a couple of, let me go here, because I'm going to have to click a couple of, I like the sassy, you can't see me, but I like the sassy, the pure people. Basically a homogeneous group, self-righteous and morally pure. They are the only ones who deserve to be heard. Vox populi, vox dei, conditions apply, right? Because it's the voice of the people, but only some people. And again, it's an empty signifier, and anybody can fit. And when you're looking here at the elite, what you have is, again, anything can be part of the elite. But basically what they do is that they're ripping off the people. all of the problems come from the elite, all sort of corruption. They are the ones who are imposing political correctness. They are the ones who are the so-called experts. And again, the experts do not talk the language of the pure people. So once you have here this idea of the populist, what is this person saying generally domestically? And that does resonate with foreign policy in many ways. There is an appeal to the past. Beware of the boogeyman, beware of the elite in whatever manifestation it has. A distrust of journalists, media, expertise, any sort of expose against the leader is taken as fake news. There's also common theme that you end up seeing in practice, which is a very not even only a hateful discourse, but the idea that you're angry and you can be very crude, but crude means honesty, so therefore it's good. Appeals to nationalism, xenophobia, ethnical, regional identity, religion, the idea that force is necessary, so you try to justify that. And as Leslie was saying, well, only I can do it, right? There's a very personalistic element into populist leaders. So when you're looking at not necessarily parties, but populist leaders is really the sense that they are the ones that can do this. It's very individual in the sense. I put here the two in the sense to say, yes, it can go right wing and it can go left wing. So it's not necessarily one or the other. But when we begin to look at populism and foreign policy, this is the one space where this idea of the other is really present, right? You're really othering. And the other isn't just another country. Again, it can be many things. We're going to go back to Brazil on this. Populism and foreign policy. And these are just a couple of points that I think are important when we're talking about this. Because first of all, you're looking at the executive realm. So foreign policy is essentially something that is to, let's say, under the control of the executive. So the executive has, in probably most countries, it's one of the spaces where the executive leader does have a lot of leeway into what they want to do. So there's an element that makes, I think, foreign policy quite attractive for the executive. There's an opportunity also for personalization to really make that person the embodiment of the state and the people of the state, on quotes. There's an opportunity, and really this seems to be quite common, of bureaucratic centralization. So you have the bureaucracy, let's say in Brazil, Itamaraty, but then it becomes even more centralized in the role of the centralizing leader. Foreign policy also allows these interesting opportunities for populist leaders, because you're talking about generally a space where you have weaker interest group pressures. So unlike domestically, where you generally have more robust, more well-established groups that are pushing forward certain, again, interest groups, agendas, or interest, in foreign policy, it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's generally not as common and not as strong. So this, again, leaves even more opportunity for the leader of the executive. And ultimately, this is one thing that, I mean, it's not fully fleshed out in terms of a theory, but I think it's a fair point to make, is that generally what you see as a reflection of populism in foreign policy is that it tends to be ad hoc and ultimately ineffective, because it's really based on the whims of whoever the person is in power. You're not listening to the experts that actually know about this stuff. So it's a short win, right? It's a Pyrrhic victory where the leader is there, he's, and it's usually a he that is doing this, but it doesn't mean it actually works. Again, only I can do it. And then you can have all of these things, all of these typical things that come out in populist discourses be really used in terms of foreign policy. So let me amuse you with my little... Yeah, I spent probably too much time trying to get this in the right proportions. But if you look at Bolsonaro, then it's not like he's not using all of these, but it's just that some of them really come into life, especially the idea of fake news. So you Again, look at everything about the Amazon, and it's the idea that it's fake news. Religion, which is one that I'm going to focus a little bit more, it's absolutely present. Nationalism, just the sort of, saying horrible things about leaders in other countries, and this beware of the boogeyman, which, yeah, and then the bizarre things of, even though it's this idea of nationalism, you always see, in the case of Brazil, the US and the Israeli flag sort of come up. And what I was going to, I'll keep, if I can ask Masu to just put this one up, slide 19, so we can just have it on the one that, almost one of the last ones, the last one that we had. Okay. And then, yeah, just a little song there waiting. Okay, there we go. And then the next box, please. There, perfect. Okay, so this is really where we come into how can we see this reflected when looking at populism and looking in foreign policy and looking at actually the consequences and let's say the empirical evidence or how this has manifested itself in terms of Brazil. So what you have really is, first of all, it's in terms of the let's say the sort of, I won't say friendships, but the sort of alliances that have shifted in order to reflect this particular view. It means a closeness with Trump, which is not surprising. I mean, although in some ways it could be, because we have to remember that it doesn't mean that because it is, let's say, right-leaning or far-right populist, that it will necessarily be pro or anti-US. I mean, if you think of Duterte has had a lot of issues with the United States. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be pro or anti because it's left. Although I'm yet to see a left-wing populist be pro-US. That would be a really bizarre case. But anyway, so what you have with Bolsonaro is really this proximity, not just with Trump, but with other far right leaning leaders. And I think this is an aspect, again, empirically, that's pretty much an innovation, because you see alliances with really unexpected countries, which is especially the case of Poland and Hungary. These are countries that strategically have never really met any, and I mean, they don't mean anything to Brazil in the sense of trade, in the sense of anything that you would consider a typical element for national interest. So it's really about the element of ideology. And in this case, this sort of odd alliance, especially when it comes to religious conservatives, which is at the base of this again, this proximity. If you need anything more of a reminder of how this is more than just only discourse, there is already an ongoing, sort of front towards. It's interesting because we keep thinking, usually we think of theocracies and very, conservative religious groups. It's supposed to be, it's in the Middle East, or it's really, certain Muslims, and that is them. Like there's a tendency to otherize. And in this case here, what you have is, I know that there was a document signed Brazil, US, Poland, and Hungary that had to do with religious persecution, but of Christians. Which not really the case. But anyway, so you have then this sympathy for these kind of leaders and really this idea of religious conservatism. And religion is a really interesting thing. I mean, I'm becoming more and more, I watch too many shows on like cults. I find it quite fascinating. And the more I look at it, the more I think there's such a strong juxtaposition between the logic of cults and because it's really about this personification. It's the savior. Obviously, in Brazil, this is made even more ironic by Jair Bolsonaro's middle name, which is Messiah. So it's like it's just a God-given pun, if you will. Bad mom jokes. But what you have is. And I think David Nemmer even wrote for this in Salon, where he was talking about Bolsonaro and talking about a Jim Jones sort of politics, with, especially in the case of COVID, which I think you can also apply to Trump. So there is, and when you have a populist and someone follows a populist, is to try to have a rational conversation and say, look, this isn't really working, like a policy perspective or something, because there is this, again, a messianic, a religious like discourse and following. So there's a core group there that you're probably not going to be able to change. And it does flow. I mean, in the case of Bolsonaro, he was talking about God over in Davos, which his minister of foreign relations actually made it a really big deal, saying, you know, it's probably the first time ever in Davos that God was mentioned. Like that's supposed to be some sort of, I don't know, superior thing. And again, when you're looking at what is the source of news, you're looking at, in this case here, Fox and Breitbart, they're probably the only ones who are supposedly the real source of information. And anti-communist is really, communist is what's at the core of, in Bolsonaro's case, when you're looking at, again, foreign policy, populism in Bolsonaro, the other, the elite, is communism, which makes for really strange bedfellows, because essentially everybody that does complain about Bolsonaro is labeled a communist. We're kind of a joke, a half joke only, to say if in 2020 you still haven't been called a communist, you're doing something wrong. Because everybody has been labeled, you know, you're a communist. This includes Francis Fukuyama as a communist. You know, Marine Le Pen has been called a communist. I mean, the Pope has been called a communist. Yeah, it's you know, it's like the Oprah meme where you get a car. It's like, you're a communist. Everybody's a communist. So it's really this idea of the empty signifier. And you see people talking about someone like the mayor of New York and saying he's from the PT. He's from, you know, US PT. And I'm like, no, he's not, because that doesn't exist. But the Workers' Party becomes this sort of, you know, the tentacle that is infiltrating all around the world. And, you know, it also reinforces, I think, what you also see in many cults, which is this idea of the conspiracy theories. So there's a lot of things that kind of go really together. I know that David does a lot of study there on this issue of, you know, the far right. And it's not like the left doesn't have its own conspiracies, it does. But there seems to be sort of a ripe environment. I mean, the ground is good there for all of these things to come up. And then who's the devil? So who's the devil in this case here in Bolsonaro? It's the so-called globalists, which, again, an empty signifier, it can mean anything, but it does have concrete consequences, because I think that's one of the points that we have to keep in mind, that this can seem like a really theoretical debate and really abstract debate. But again, I've been out of Brazil since 2008. And it's been interesting to see in these past 12 years the shift from being, you know, when I left Brazil to go and do my PhD, it was like, oh my God, you're leaving. And oh, I don't know, I'd never have the courage, and why are you doing this? And people questioning, to about 2012, 2013, people asking, how do I do it? So I began to have, you know, a shift from people asking, you know, in Brazil nowadays, I'll take an Uber or I'm in a cab, and, you know, I say that I'm from Brazil, and the face is like, oh, you know, it's not a good reaction. Like, even people that are not specialists, it's visible. I mean, that for me is one of the most surprising things, is to see, yeah, it does make an impact. Again, who are the enemies? And the kind, in the case here of Bolsonaro, this elite is, in the case China, kind of, I mean, it's sort of a delicate balance there, because it still is by far Brazil's #1 trader. But you see a lot of people in the government who will put them in this idea of the other to be combated and to be feared. Venezuela, obviously, but then France. And I mean, the list pretty much of anyone who actually complains about Bolsonaro, the category of the other and the one to be rejected. Obviously, leftist international news. So basically anybody. So this again is a reflection, like Leslie was saying, the reflection between the two-sided coins, between what is domestic and between what is external. So if the New York Times or even the Wall Street Journal or, you know, the Guardian, whoever is saying something bad about Bolsonaro, they are part of the leftist cabal. They're part of the globalist elite and the agenda, and there's, I don't know, lizard people. And obviously, in the case of the international NGOs, like Greenpeace, obviously one of the big enemies. And so this, in many ways, it's how it's been portrayed in Brazil. So there is an issue, again, with what Leslie was saying. And I think when you are looking into empirical cases of populism, you really need to be focused on each case, because you do have, because it is this sort of, you know, thin ideology, you can put it into many different shapes and you can sort of give it different colors. So this is the case of Brazil under Bolsonaro, but you're going to have different variations wherever you go. So in the case here, there is some element of xenophobia, especially towards Venezuelans and towards Bolivians, but it's not the key element. It's not the anchor of this sort of debate as it is, let's say, in the United States with the wall and, you know, the Mexicans. So you do have the sort of variation. But I want to go to just the next slide. And if you can play that one, which is the first thing, any Brazilian knows already where this GIF is going, if you can play that one, which is the question that when you begin to talk about Bolsonaro and foreign policy, it's like, well, but what about Lula? What about PT? And I get it, but it's kind of annoying because, you know, and I'm like, that's not my case study. That I'm looking at Bolsonaro. But since I began to research this, and, you know, I have people in my family who are, you know, anti-Lula / Bolsonaro supporters. And that's one of the things that they'll ask. And I'm like, that's a separate discussion. And I'll go with Guilherme and saying, I think there are elements. Yes, there are elements that when you look into Lula's domestic policy and foreign policy, there are elements of populism, especially I think in this idea of a more personalistic approach and a more messianic, I am the one, I am the person. And again, this construction of, you know, the other. So it's capitalism, it's the United States, it's the global North, which I'm not saying that it necessarily is right or wrong, but you do have an element there. But I think you cannot put in the same boat, in the same level of, especially if you see it not as populist, non-populist, but if you see populism as being as a little bit populist and really a lot populist, you'll see elements of populism. See, the sun's coming out here. Let me put this blind down. So what you'll see with Lula are elements, but personally, I would not, the way I see the understanding of populism, I wouldn't frame him as a populist. I'd say he has populist elements. Again, we can discuss this and agree to disagree, and I'd like to hear others' opinions. But with Bolsonaro, it's pretty much it's a given, whether we like it or not. So for me, that's that. And shout out to everybody from Nordeste, especially Ceará. And thanks for having me.
Deborah, thank you so much. Yeah, I totally agree with the fact that when we talk about Bolsonaro, it's the whole package, right? It's always the whole package. I mean, in everything he does, we see, I mean, we can even check every single aspect of populism in whatever he does. So thank you so much for that. Davi, now it's your turn. Thank you so much. Davi is not only one of the leading scholars on far-right populism in Brazil, but also a very good friend of mine. And we coordinate together the far-right observatory. So we have this contribution to the public debate through the observatory. So thank you so much for taking your time to be here.
Good morning, everyone. In the case of Deborah, good morning. Good morning for Deborah. Good evening, everyone. Well, first of all, I would like to start by thanking Guilherme Casarões for inviting me to this debate. I welcome your initiative to organize a roundtable on populism and foreign policy. We all know that populism has primarily been studied as a domestic phenomenon, especially here in Latin America. So the idea of discussing the international dimensions of populism is quite urgent, in my opinion. So, Casarões, congratulations. And of course, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to discuss Deborah and Leslie presentations this evening. And I will begin by taking up some of the main ideas that Deborah and Leslie brought to this roundtable, focusing on how both presentation relate to each other. And after that, I will try to highlight some points that caught my attention, proposing some questions for the debate, right? Well, the first thing, the first interesting convergence I have found is that you too adopted the concept of populism formulated by Kasmud and Kaltwasser. I think it was, in my opinion, a very good choice. You know? I like this concept so much that I adopted the book you mentioned in the course I teach on the global right, global radical right here at São Paulo, at Pontifícia Universidade of São Paulo. So I understand that, so let me put this way. I understand that an ideational approach to such definition can accurately capture the core of all significant past and present manifestations of populism. And besides that, the conception of populism as a think-centered ideology is convenient since populism can take many shapes, mixing with thick ideologies such as nationalism, neoliberalism, and socialism. Thus, with that definition, we can understand why populism is so malleable in the real world. For instance, Leslie analyzed two subtypes of populism in his article. Carlos Mening's neoliberal populism and Hugo Chavez' socialist populism. And Deborah, in turn, is researching the radical right populism of Bolsonaro. So a definition of populism as a thin ideology and sustained by the tripod of people, elite, and general will looks quite appropriate, in my opinion. So, but at the same time, and looking especially at Latin American populism, I question if we could neglect, and I include myself in this case, neglect the classical literature in the field of social sciences, which developed mainly in Argentina and Brazil during the 1950s and 1960s, seeking to interpret the populist experience of Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, Juan Domingos Perón in Argentina, and Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico. I'm referring to authors such as Rini Hermano, Torquato Di Tella, both Argentinians, Otávio Ianni, and Francisco Vefort, two distinguished Brazilian sociologists. I didn't mention Ernest Laclau here because he is the most cited Latin American scholar on populism outside our region, probably because it's a hypothesis, but probably because he spent much of his academic life in England. So just to illustrate my point here, Rino Hermani and Torquato Di Tella built models that intended to explain populism in Latin America, understanding that it occurred in a situation of transition from a so-called traditional society, agrarian and pre-capitalist, to the modern society, capitalist, urban, and industrial. So the roots of populism were in the asynchrony between the process of transition from one society to another. Short, my question is that I would like to know from you, Deborah and Leslie, what do you think is the importance of classic sociologists of populism in understanding Latin American populism today? And do you think they are old-fashioned, outdated, or are those sociologists proper only to analyze the first wave of populism that took place in the region between the 1930s and the 1950s? I mean, do you think they still offer a theoretical framework to understand different trends of populism nowadays in Latin America? Or could we see, could we use the sociological method to understand more deeply the third populist wave in Latin America? So I put this question because at every time I'm reading those authors and trying to see how they make sense today. Okay, so let me move to the next topic. Leslie, I read your fascinating paper, Populism Nexus, which was the base of your presentation. And I would like to bring to my comments here some ideas that occurred to me when I was reading it yesterday, right? So first, the theoretical framework that you propose in the paper to comprehend the relationship between populism and foreign policy is very, very sophisticated. You were able to blend in a refined way the definition of populism that I mentioned earlier with the role theory approach. So this is, by the way, as Casarón it's a topic you have been researching for a long time, right? 2 or 3 years ago, I read a paper in which you discuss using role theory, how Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela perceived Brazil's regional leadership. But anyway, that combination I just mentioned looks like an excellent alternative to approach the international ramifications of populism. However, after your presentation of role theory, you made 2 propositions to guide the empirical analysis of the cases of Menem and Chavez. And here, I will quote you. So, first proposition that is related to domestic dimension is that the role play of a populist leader in regional and extra-regional relations will be shaped by their left or right political ideology, socialist or neoliberal social economic orientation, and protectionist or free trade orientation in response to globalization. So this is the first proposition. The second proposition that is related to international dimension is that the more, it's very interesting, the more a populist leader strives for autonomy and adopts an anti-core orientation, the more likely his or her foreign policy will reflect an anti-elitist and pro-people components in its narratives. And the more leader is close to the axis of dependence, then autonomy and pro-core, then anti-core, the less his or her foreign policy will show narratives and actions that reflect anti-elitism and pro-masses. So, in your article, you demonstrated in the last section of your paper that both propositions fit very well in the two cases you chose. And that's to say, Chavez's independent and anti-core foreign policy made it possible to use an anti-elitist and pro-people domestic narrative. Perfect. And Argentine foreign policy under Manning, who was extremely dependent on the United States and very pro-core, has failed to produce an anti-elitist and pro-people narrative. Right. Now I wonder how those propositions help us here in Brazil to understand the relationship between populism and foreign policy in Bolsonaro's government. We know that Bolsonaro foreign policy chose to establish a devoted alignment with the United States. I'd say that is more ardent than Manning's carnal relations and relaciones carnales with the United States. And yet, Bolsonaro has been able to produce an anti-elitist narrative at the domestic level. Maybe because what Bolsonaro government calls the elite in Brazil is associated with, in its view, of course, a progressive and anti-American groups, or such as press, academics, and even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, Itamaraty. At the same time, what he defines internationally as elite includes transnational groups and international organizations which defend, of course, in their paranoid view, a globalist agenda to undermine state sovereignty and Christian values. So it seems to me, to be simultaneously a pro-America and an anti-core foreign policy. Perhaps in it's another hypothesis. Perhaps it is because the nature of the Brazil-US alliance relies essentially on the close ties established between Bolsonaro governments and the person of Donald Trump, who is a model of anti-globalist leader for Brazilian president. So, likewise, we cannot also, likewise, we cannot say that the thick ideology that guides Bolsonaro's populism is nationalism. That's my view, and I'll try to explain why. Because in general, what moves the current Brazilian foreign policy is more a conservative approach of Westernism than nationalism. And by Westernism, I mean the claiming to project Brazil, our foreign policy, into a Judeo-Christian cultural matrix. So there is a compelling influence of religion on the ideology that guides Brazilian forms. Therefore, liberal international order, global governance, and multilateral structures are perceived as a threat to our Christian values. So, in that case, Brazil enacts two different roles. It's a proud ally of the United States, and at the same time, it plays an anti-core role. And let me make the last commentary on this topic. You say in your paper that, now I'll quote you again, if populism is fed by nationalism as a thin ideology, then the most likely roles a populist government will play are that of an isolated non-alignment role and internal developer. So I see all those characteristics in Brazilian foreign policy, not during Bolsonaro government, but during the military dictatorship, mainly during the Ernesto Geisel government that some of the Brazilian scholars used to call the autonomy by distance. So it resulted from a kind of combination of autonomous diplomacy with state-driven economy. And so it has nothing to do with Bolsonaro's thick ideology. And that kind of nationalism, for instance, is also not supported by the neoliberal economic diplomacy led by Paulo Guedes, a former Chicago boy, who is currently Brazilian economy minister. Sorry. So maybe we can think of a type of religious nationalism, a topic Guilherme Casarões has been studying, but a religious nationalism combined with the new liberal economic ideology. That's odd combination. That's odd combination that at the same time has allowed the government to present itself as a pro-globalization and an anti-globalism. And globalism, as we know very well, is a conspiratory theory that we should not take serious. So what they call anti-globalism, I call anti-liberalism. In other words, they want to reap the so-called benefits of free market economy, while they don't accept the cosmopolitan ideology driven by globalization. I would say that somehow a tropical branch of the alt-right, and that challenges conventional typifications of thick political ideologies. So I understand the thick ideologies that drives Bolsonaro populism is a puzzling task. I know that your paper does not deal with the Brazilian case. Still, it allows us to think to what extent the theoretical framework you propose could shed light on Bolsonaro's populism and how it affects Brazilian foreign policy. For these are my comments. Thank you again, Casarões, Deborah, Leslie. My class at Pontifícia Universidade Católica, PUC, starts in 30 minutes, so I'm afraid I have to leave early. Okay, thank you very much.
Davi, thank you so much for your comments. They were very enlightening. I really appreciate them. So let's move on to the questions. I have a few questions here from our YouTube viewers. I'll perhaps let's see how many questions we actually have. Well, let me do the following. I'll pass on the word to Leslie and to Deborah just to respond to David's comments, and then we can move on to the questions because I think we have enough time. So there's no need to put them all together. So Leslie, feel free to respond to David's comments.
All right, very briefly, David. I mean, thank you so much for your comments. I think they're very, some of them are very spot on, and I think, of course, it's a good way for me to challenge our paper in a way that actually make us think about the future projects as well, right? And that's the idea of this. I think that when you talk about the sociology literature of the 50s, I think, yes, that is very valuable, right? And I think it's very useful to understand a period of populism that emerged before the bipolar system emerged. Right, in some cases, right. So in other cases, we see how these states adopt foreign policies within, a bipolar system under the Cold War. So in that regard, we kept that aside from our research venture because our interest was mainly just trying to elaborate within the current debates, the current problems, and the emergence of populism in nowadays. Trying to create a theoretical framework that could help us to understand the foreign policy actions and whether we can talk, after all, about populist foreign policy. So, but I'm not. We went into the literature, and I think this is something that perhaps it's someone that you can invite to one of the seminars, who is Daniel Wagner. that has actually, I'm sure, I peer review his article that is forthcoming in the Journal of International Relations and Development, in which he takes all the waves of populism, right? However, his contribution, and he takes that literature that you suggest, and it's a rich literature for sure. So I was one of the peer reviewers of that article, yeah, anonymously, obviously. But we find actually our conclusions with Cameron's are not that different from what he finds out, right? But there you have to include the different structures of the international system that constrains actors, and even constrains actors like populist leaders as well. So we have different type of settings. So we wanted to work with more of a current setting, and in this case we have the case of Menem and Venezuela and so on, and that could shed light on something more alike in terms of these states experiencing certain similar structural constraints and pressures from the system. So that's the only reason why we keep it aside. But I think I agree with you. It's a high value on that. Now, when it comes to the causal process observations, I think we went into this. This is more of the research process, I believe. We just went in and very much of using or relying on the benefits of analytical eclecticism when it comes to casting an article or a research. So we move between in so-called abductive way. So it's between deduction and induction. So our propositions are causal process observations, so which serve us to link the theory with the case and narrow down the case. So in that regard, we don't aspire much more to those cases. However, I think we take on board that what you suggest about about how does it work for the case of Brazil. I think after all, I think well, I don't know whether I understood you right, but I would say that nationalism is still a key component of the populist experience and project of Bolsonaro. Of course, it mixed with other type of ideologies. I don't see a concrete thick ideology there. I see more of thin ideologies, right? In which nationalism is manipulated and stretched to capture certain religious motives, but that serve the purpose of flagging up the nation, right? So the nationalist component, I see it quite strongly there. We might, in that regard, we might disagree a bit, but from that nationalism, we see that actually the foreign policy of Bolsonaro tends to enact certain roles that actually try to establish a role relationship with the U.S., but not than the U.S. with Trump directly. So I don't think we need to question whether Bolsonaro is trying to alter cast Trump as a friend, and whether there is a reciprocity in that role relationship from Trump to Bolsonaro. It seems that it's more those interactions are very sporadic. They don't take root. There is no kind of a location of a concrete role in terms of of that might take root and have taken root, and actually it tells us a lot about of long-term projections of the foreign policy role-based behavior of Brazil. Of course, there is a change there, right? There is a new orientation, but you play roles with someone else in a relational manner, and those roles have to be validated and legitimated by others, right? In a specific context or in broader context. And in the specific context, I think sometimes Trump it doesn't reciprocate much, I would say, right? So it is the role of Brazil as a state, or is it the role of Bolsonaro as bringing some changes to the role repertoire of Brazil, right? So, and something similar happens, and the interesting part is that something similar happens with Trump, right? And I think that very briefly about some question on the impact of populism in diplomacy. Someone asked here, because as bureaucrats, diplomats are expected to represent the government. So I would, from the angle of my article and the role theory apparatus, I will try to see, the contestation of those roles. I think, this is something that I can refer you to some other work that I published previously in International Studies Review, and actually on the work of Juliette Carbo and Christian Cantier that talk about role contestation. And role contestation happens domestically, and it happens not only across political parties, about public opinion, but also happens within bureaucracies, and we see competing bureaucracies. The role of the iteramati that might undermine the role, might contest the role, but at the same time might affect that contestation, affect the role that Bolsonaro wants to play on behalf of Brazil. So those would be initial thoughts about that question, and that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, if I could just add just a little bit, and just to say with Davi's comments. The challenge, I think, when it comes to Bolsonaro and talking about the issue of nationalism is because, yes, there is a lot of the national discourse and, Brazil above all, and the Brazilian flag, literally rallying around the flag. But the nation in this case, the separation of the nation and the other is not necessarily let's say, especially a foreign group. It's really about within Brazil. So you're talking about a nation that is built only from the pure people, or the good citizens, the cidadãos de bem. They are the ones who really compose. And I mean, I think I read the other day that even the sense of the good citizen was something used in the KKK back in the day, to mention, who are that. So yeah, there are some good things going on there. And also you end up doing that using also the no true Scotsman fallacy. So if you have someone that, let's say, considers themselves, a cidadão de bem and part of the pure people, or sort of claims to be, and then does something wrong, is corrupt, or, just does a whole bunch of other things, like, no, but they're not a true cidadão de bem. So you kind of create really this sort of separation of who is the nation, who does the nation speak to. So that is, I think, one of the most fascinating parts about really looking at populism. It's how it's almost like you're playing with Play-Doh, because you can kind of mold it, the way that you want it to look. And what I will say, and I absolutely agree with you, Davi, is this paradoxical relationship that populism has with globalization, where in the case, especially if you look at the right-wing ones, what you'll find usually is that the market or free market is a good place, but the cosmopolitan values, the progressive values, they're considered bad. But it's really interesting into, again, how it's a buffet style. Like, you pick and choose the elements of globalization you find that suit the discourse. So, for example, even if you look at something like Steve Bannon's The Movement, I mean, how can you be anti-globalist when your whole goal is to really, through global links and international, transnational networks, be creating a pro-right group? I mean, I know that also even in Poland, that they're having, all these debates about abortion. A lot of the money was funded from, I think, like Billy Graham, or people in the really, really sort of very hardcore conservative Christian, that are really funneling in, this money for a whole bunch of campaigns. So it's only saying no to certain elements of globalization that they don't like. And so it's not a whole package thing. And this, again, this is interesting when you think, I was talking to this with Guilherme the other day and saying how fascinating it is that even if you think about Poland and Hungary, that they, I mean, from their perspective, they are aligning with the global South, with Brazil. They're aligning with, a country that would probably be seen. I mean, I don't think that probably Brazilians are probably treated very much differently than all Latin Americans or most foreigners if you go to a very conservative place. But it's like, no, they're different. They're one of the good guys. And again, not to forget with this, buffet style of what to pick and choose, the link between Bolsonaro's son and CPAC, right, in the United States with the conservative movement. So it's also about how you have these transnational networks that they use they are part of a globalized structure, while they, at face value can't take it, but they say that they do reject, but they're actually rejecting just the little bits that they don't want. And again, it tends to be a very, if you want to put gender theory there, it's a very masculine discourse. There's a lot of fragile males out there. It's like, oh my God, if I wear pink, I'm going to get cooties, and like Bolsonaro was in Maranhão, where they have a pop that's like a pink color. And he's like, oh my God, I take it. And it's like, dude, if you touch pink and you think you're going to become gay, there's an issue with you. Like you have some serious stuff that you need to deal with. And again, just to reiterate a final point, is that it's really about an alliance between Bolsonaro and Trump, not Bolsonaro in the United States. If anybody saw, there was a video that came out yesterday, the last 24 hours or something, that he was, talking to people, and someone asked about Biden and, possibly Biden winning or Trump. And he just gives like a big sigh and says, Deus te ouça, may God hear you, that, that Trump is going to win, because he knows that it's based on this sort of flimsy, bilateral relationship. And it's not even a true bilateral relationship, right? I don't think Trump really cares about Bolsonaro at all. But it's something that it sells if you believe, whatever comes to you in WhatsApp. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Sorry, can I say something very briefly there from what Deborah says? It's spot on in terms of, what you mentioned. And I think, the concept, and this is what I was trying to express, that this triad of people, anti-elite, and general will, you can stretch those things. And those are social constructs, but those social constructs are defined from the leader's perspective. So the leader can include and exclude people from it. But at the same time, as you said, Deborah, the leader can cherry pick what element it wants to extract for certain ideology, but also promote externally when it comes to foreign policy. And I was thinking about a concept here is that branding. They, in a way, it might be, comes from marketing and so on, but leaders, and this goes, not only populist leaders, but leaders in general, when they cherry pick certain elements and cast a new role to be played, a new type of orientation in foreign policy that doesn't have much cultural material at home domestically, or is difficult to sell somehow, it needs that kind of cherry picking process and projected externally and branded, so that roles tend to locate it. That's very theoretical, but I think in my work in this case. So it just was to complement what you said. Thank you.
Leslie, I really want to talk to you about this very specific point, because one of the coincidences that has happened in Brazil is that the three best known populist presidents that we've had, Jânio Quadros, Fernando Collor, and Bolsonaro, the three of them, who, by the way, got elected in intervals of 30 years from each other, the three of them have traveled, and I've been writing about this, but I had to stop because I had no theoretical framework to work on. But basically, the three of them traveled during the campaign because they needed to attach their own images to something else, which was not there domestically, right? So, for example, Jânio Quadros, he wanted to break with the pro-Vargas, anti-Vargas dichotomy, so he needed to present something new. So that's why he chose to travel, by the way, that was 1960, to Cuba. Cuba had just had its revolution, and he was a right-winger, he was a conservative, this crazy moralist conservative, but he flew to Cuba, and he used to walk around Brasilia wearing, what's the name of that, Nasser kind of dress? It's a slack? Yeah, it's a slack. So he used to walk around dressed in a slack. So that was a very populist thing to do. Fernando Collor, when he got elected, he wanted to break with the pro-military, anti-military dichotomy, he flew to Europe, and there he met with Felipe Gonzalez and Margaret Thatcher, and he shook hands with the Pope. And basically, he wanted to present himself as some sort of social democrat / neoliberal kind of person who was very modern and very different from anything Brazil had ever had before. Bolsonaro the same. By the way, he was the only candidate who traveled during the campaign, and even before the official campaign, he flew to Israel, and then he was baptized in the Jordan River, like an evangelical thing, and then he flew to the United States, where he strengthened his anti-globalist credentials, and then he traveled to Asia, and his Asia tour was really bizarre because he went to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and I mean, the Chinese embassy in Brazil even sent a repudiation letter to Bolsonaro saying, I don't know why this Brazilian lawmaker went to Taiwan, but let me tell you something. The Chinese said, if any of you Brazilian lawmakers want to go to Taiwan, you have to ask China first, because after all, this is Chinese territory. Yeah. So basically, I think that there's a very interesting point from a theoretical point of view that you've just brought up, which is those populists, they need to break with the past, and sometimes the only reference they can find is abroad. Yeah. So they have to attach themselves to something which is out there, and that's where the relevance of traveling abroad, overseas during the campaign is. Yes. This is something that American presidents don't do, for example, or that's something that European presidents don't do, or prime ministers. I mean, things are very different anyways. Yeah. But let me just finish this wonderful discussion with a last question from Mauricio Ojeda. He asked about the new Chilean context. Leslie, are you Chilean?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So that's the perfect question.
Yes. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So basically, he's asking about the prospects for a new populist leader in the likes of Pamela Giles or José Antonio Cast.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I'm not specialist on comparative politics, domestic politics, but what I can say that populism, populist notions and populist strategies has always been present in Chile. A different story is whether Chile has elected populist leaders in the past. And I think, we have seen in the 90s, with, or the 2000s, early 2000s, the role of Joaquin Lavín and other populist leaders that comes from the right. But also as well, we see more like nowadays these Pamela Giles and José Antonio Castro at different political spectrums. And in the context in which we have undermined, for many reasons, rhetorically, but also by the actions of political parties, have undermined the quality and the prestige and reputations of political parties as able to channel the inputs and the demands from society. We see that possibly the value of the structure of political parties have changed dramatically and has been generating space for populist leaderships. A different story is that whether we elect them or not. And in that regard, I cannot forecast that because I don't have a crystal ball for that. But if you let me very briefly about what you were telling me before about your point, I think one of the key aspects, and I was thinking about ontological securities here. Leaders also experience ontological security. They feel ontologically insecure. And one of the key characteristics of populist leaders is that they sometimes lack the credentials of acting as a statesman. Mm-hmm. When they go into the position, they're constantly questioned. That makes them feel insecure of who they are. And once they adopt the institutional role of being president or prime minister and so on, and they have to serve sometimes outside, right, for that validation, right, to show themselves as a statesman by going to Cuba, by going to Felipe Gonzalez, or so on. So that's possibly a key aspect. But, however, I think at some point they also have to stretch national reality, the history of the country. And this, more than the history, the story of the country, because that is about narratives that you can manipulate and stretch and so on. So sometimes, like when Bolsonaro talks about, about religious stuff, right? He's trying to depict and construct that Brazil has been always a religious society, right? Possibly for a minority or a minority group, but he just stretched that and tried to cast a narrative and a storytelling that Brazil has all these values, right? Possibly. Thank you.
That's so interesting. So, Deborah, would you like to make any further comments on populism and diplomacy? Felipe has a question. Leslie has already addressed it. It's basically, if you could say a few words on populism and democracy and diplomacy, sorry. He says, I ask that because as bureaucrats, diplomats are expected to represent the government no matter who's in charge. So what are the contradictions? And yeah, so please.
I think it goes into the element of, for a lot of populists, really this idea of the elite. The elite is also where experts belong to. So generally experts, no good. And I think it's one of the challenges because they have, I mean, the diplomats, as I think general, public servants in general, they have a dual role, which is, yes, they serve the executive. So if you go to Brasilia, the Esplanada is just an obvious visual representation. They're serving the executive. But at the same time, their ultimate service should be to the nation. And the service to the nation in this case would be with their expertise to say, look, I know this stuff. And let me tell you, if we do this, this is probably what's going to happen. So I think there comes with a duality of saying, look, who am I ultimately not responsible, but who
loyal to?
Who do I serve? Yeah, are you serving the nation with the long term and then look, it's not just the Esplanada, it's not just the leader of the executive, but I'm actually doing this for the betterment of, the nation? Or are you a handmaiden for whomever is in power? So I think that's what makes it challenging. And I think in a democracy, what should happen is that, at least ideally, you would have the leader of the executive taking into account. It doesn't mean that they're going to follow just whatever the experts are saying, but that they're going to take into account a variety of expertise, and they're going to look at it. And in theory, they should be able to say, okay, there's a lot of different opinions, or no, everybody agrees with this. And you kind of listen to that. Now, the problem is that really, Itamaraty, really in Brazil, the Ministry of Foreign Relations, it's for the first time, because you had some element of that during Lula's tenure, but really this one is where dissent is not allowed. It's really, really not allowed. And you really get into trouble. And it's even if you say that it's a torn loyalty. Are you loyal to, in this case, the executive, the president, or is your loyalty to the state? And I think that's where you create this sort of tension and the dissonance between the expertise and the opinion making, and people who have the expertise but will just say, I'm not going to be, I'm going to be a wallflower here because the tall poppy is the first one to get cut. So I'm going to stay in my lane and wait 4 years, and this shall pass, and then I can have, so you kind of step aside.
Yeah, I think there's one last thing about this, which is also fascinating. If we look back into like 1930s and 40s populism in Latin America, those populists back in the day, they were institution builders. They used populism to build the state. Of course, I mean, as a mirror reflection of their own interests and values and so on and so forth. But both Vargas and Perón, they were institution builders, and even though they very often intended to speak to the people without mediation, but they were also building the state right there. Nowadays, if you want to be a populist, that was the case of Menem, and that was the case of Bolsonaro, for example. If you want to become a populist, then you have to push all institutions aside, because now they are an obstacle. Because you want to connect to the people, and you can't have any institutional or bureaucratic mediation. this is bad for populism. So one of the things that we see in Brazil, and I think that that's the reason why Felipe, who's a friend of mine, asked this question, we see Itamaraty, which is a 2-century-old institution, one of the most prestigious ministries in Brazil, and perhaps one of the most professional diplomacies in the world. They've been torn to pieces. They've been destroyed completely by Bolsonaro's foreign minister. And one of the fears when Bolsonaro got elected, I'm not sure if Leslie remember this, but basically one of the discussions that we had between October and December 2018 was who was going to be Bolsonaro's foreign minister, because most people expected either a politician or an ideologue, I mean a total outsider. And when he appointed Ernesto Araújo as foreign minister, who's a career diplomat, who was an unknown career diplomat, people sighed in relief, because they basically thought, well, at least it's going to be somebody who's going to live up to the traditions and to the structure of Itamaraty, and then things went completely astray, right? Yeah.
No, that's actually, a good question, but the question is whether that person who is the foreign affairs minister, whether has been empowered by Bolsonaro with the ability to make decisions on behalf of the state. And I think that's different. And I think what we observe in most populists, I'm doing a research on the personality traits of Donald Trump and Hugo Chavez and how those shape the foreign policy choices that they make, right? Social psychology applied to foreign policy, and then we find that actually most of the traits of these two is that actually they have a high level of distrust. So, and it is connected, of course, as a strategy to minimize and reduce the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, and that also means to bring the decision-making power in foreign policy to the governmental palace, and not even with a bureaucracy. It's just people that they trust, that are part of the so-called the people in the populist project, rather than the bureaucracy, right? So basically what the bureaucracy, or in this case the foreign affairs apparatus, become basically tend to implement foreign policy, and actually doesn't have much power there, but they contest the role anyway.
Yeah, I would also just add that, I mean, also in this case, what you see with Trump, and you probably see in Bolsonaro and others, is this distrust about the deep state, right? So while you had the first movement sort of creating the state, now it's this idea that there's a deep state, and the deep state is the one whose tentacles is going all around, and not, they're the ones who really have the strings, and the leader is cutting off all these strings so the state can really serve the people. And again, it makes a challenge for anyone who has technical expertise, whether it's foreign policy or any other area, because disagreement is seen as betrayal, right? Disagreement is not conceived as, look, here's why, this is not really the best strategy or whatever. It's like, no, you are betraying the state. You are betraying the people. And I think that is, again, that's why you have ultimately, in terms of domestic policy and foreign policy, especially, is this sort of ad hoc and ultimately inefficient. But the inefficiency is not perceived as my inefficiency. It's an inefficiency that comes because of the deep state, because of, foreign forces, because, because of whatever comes to play. Those are the ones who are really responsible for the inefficiency. It's never, the leader. Although, to be fair, it's not only to populists. There's a saying that while victory has many fathers, failure is an orphan. So nobody wants to take responsibility for when things go bad. It's always someone else's fault. But I think in the case of populism, that is even more deeply internalized as something purposeful, as something by, these sort of, again, it's the boogeyman that's hiding in the shadows, and it sort of justifies all sorts of behaviors because you don't see them, but I do. I know what they're doing.
The other day I saw a Trump supporter on Twitter standing up for Trump, because many people criticize Trump for not having delivered much in 4 years. And the key argument in Trump's defense was, well, he spent 4 years draining the swamp. What else would you expect? So, I mean, populism is very often justified in those terms. I mean, Bolsonaro's been destroying the deep state, so kudos to him. Yeah.
And you make it in a way that the worse it gets, the better it gets. No, it's really bad because he's really fighting, you know? And so you again, it's about crafting the narrative. But I think what is different, because you can say, well, any president does that, any government does that. But I think the difference is that is used at a higher degree, and it tends to be more detached from reality. And even if it is detached from reality, it's like, this is a big fat lie. That's what it is. The cult mentality. It doesn't allow you to break away and see the polity and its polarity, or see, well, you know, I do like these elements of, you know, these policies, but I don't like this. It's either you're in or you're out. There's no, I mean, once you drink the Kool-Aid, it's almost like you can't, you know, go back, because also if you detach, then you're questioning your own ethos, you're questioning your identity.
Yeah.
So it's again, I think for me, what I'd be interested in moving forward is really to try to see these sort of links, again, like Guilherme is sort of doing, but look at the links between the populist discourse and the sort of populist framework, and mirror that, juxtapose that with cults and cult approaches. Because I think that whether consciously or unconsciously, there's a really interesting overlap between the two.
Yeah.
There's this very interesting Reza Aslan's talk on Trump and religious cults. Basically, it's a YouTube channel called Big Think. I mean, Reza Aslan, he's a polemist, right? He's a good scholar of religion, but he tries to relate people's relationship with Trump with some sort of religious cult. So he's the cult leader. He's untouchable for those reasons. I don't know exactly. I mean, I think it's shallow, but maybe the best argument that there's this very new book called Taking America Back for God, published by Andrew Whitehead, which claims pretty much the same thing. I mean, evangelical Christians in America, they don't care for Trump's misbehavior, because Trump is, I mean, some sort of higher than life figure who's going to enable the Christian nationalist project. So it doesn't matter who he is or what he does, as long as he empowers religious nationalism in America, that's enough for them.
Yeah, and all means justify the ends.
Oh, yeah.
So even if the messenger is flawed, well, who isn't flawed? I'm like, well, I'm flawed, but I've never paid prostitutes, you know, with, I don't know, like paid to silence them because I was in a campaign, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
But I think, and just to say something of what Deborah said, how to move things forward in terms of, you know, doing research on the nexus of populism and foreign policy, I think there are many possibilities. Actually, we might be all wrong right here, and because we haven't compared very much populist foreign policies from vis-a-vis non-populist foreign policy. Actually, we might ask ourselves whether populist foreign policies bring more change to the foreign policy orientation of a country vis-a-vis non-populist. And of course, you're thinking, guys, in the case of Bolsonaro, that has done it, but also, you know, Lula brought change as well. There is a continuity, of course, with, you know, with the pillar set by Fernando Enrique Cardoso, right? But we see changes. What is change, actually? But if we brought and bring other cases, we really have to pay attention whether populist leaders or not brings more change than non-populist leaders. That is a question of research. And another one is the type, as we see here, and Deborah, I was listening to you, very, very paying attention to what you were saying. You talk a lot about personal characteristics of the leader, right? So personality traits, and there is well-established methods in foreign policy, like leadership trait analysis or operational code analysis, to study key characteristics, personal characteristics or political profile, revealing the political profile of the leader, and how those things shape the key characteristic of someone, shape the foreign policy actions on decision making in this case. And then a third part that also, by listening to Deborah's presentation, I think, there is a lot about, conspiracy theory. And I know that Feliciano de Sá-Guimarães is starting to work on this topic, which is very fascinating. And I have talked very briefly to him about, how leaders sometimes use conspiracy theories in foreign policy. And that's the case of leaders. In my case, I'm working on how leaders tend to use build images and stereotypes, and those stereotypes actually become simplifications of roles and so on in foreign policy advanced by leaders. So I think that's something to think about in terms of how we go from here to the future in the study of the nexus of populism and foreign policy, including the case of Brazil.
Yeah, no, and I mean, just to add, just to piggyback on that, but even the idea of QAnon, and how you have, again, these sort of transnational conspiracies. So conspiracies aren't just even more, just limited to a domestic group, but they can sort of be transferred into, but how that is purposefully transferred from one place to another. And I think it would be interesting if there was a way to test or hypothesize or analyze what a lot of people see to say there tends to be a higher number. And let's say to the right, you have people who follow conspiracy theories in both right and left. So anti-vaxxer is usually something more attached really to the left, although now it's, kind of muzzled up, it's more politicized. But it's to say, is this something that's a phenomenon only in right-wing sort of populism, more in the right-wing sort of populism? How does that translate? And I mean, in some ways, it is a newer phenomenon, because before you didn't have, when you didn't have WhatsApps and Facebooks and Twitter and all that, it was a lot more limited in order to be really transferring the conspiracy theory. It moved, but it moved probably at a much more glacial pace. You really needed to have, let's say, someone on the microphone saying something on, live TV for everybody to listen. And now you don't have that. Now, I think it's also interesting to imagine when that's actually, what are the limits to that? And how does that impact things on the long term, especially because it's, again, detached from reality. So you're not even really talking about policy. Policy is secondary. It's really about the images that are being crafted and how much that sort of resonates with people. And what are the limits with that? So you have Trump saying, one of his accomplishments in his administration was ending COVID. Like he just said that about 24 hours ago, the Office of Science and Policy and the White House saying that, he ended the COVID epidemic. And people are looking around and saying, no, you did not. There's like more people. It's like the third wave. But if you think it's a hoax, COVID isn't real, then I don't know. It's these are weird times. I mean, these are just difficult times, I think, to sort of try to understand. I think, and I mean, sorry to be blunt, but it's just how many gullible people are out there and how many stupid. Like, I think one thing that, social media has revealed, it's like, I didn't know there were so many dumb people out there. Like, I thought people had a little bit more, in them. But again, that's why someone like me or like us saying this, it's like, oh, you're such an elitist, you're the expert. What do you know? And I'm like, yeah, sorry, I don't do this for a living. But yeah, you're debating political flat earthers. In many cases, and then it's not, it's not how do you compete with that?
Deborah, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Once again, let me thank both Leslie and you for giving us a bit of your time to be here with us to talk about such an important and fascinating issue. And I hope to see you guys in another opportunity, maybe in person. Let's hope we can next year bring you guys to Brazil to have a different sort of roundtable, maybe a beer at the end of it. So, yeah.
That's good.
So thank you so much for that. Yeah, so thank you so much for that. And I thank the audience. There's still a lot of people watching us on YouTube. So thank you so much. And I hope to see you at other ABRI events.
Yes,
thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
Have a great week.
Thanks for to the audience as well.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
thanks everyone.
Bye.
Cheers from Sydney.
Bye.
Pronto.